Hey, yo, what it did, y'all? Let's get right into it. Yesterday, there was a great interview done by Gazzy and Darth Mackridge, actually, with Jonathan Rogers. They talked about a lot of stuff that actually was not in the announcement. And they've mentioned some stuff in there that reminded me that I had this video on my mind. Specifically, they talked about the fact that the reflect map modifier no longer is going to be in PoE 2, right? Like, that's going away. We won't have to deal with that going into PoE 2. And it made me think about how bad map modifiers have been for so long, or at least how bad some of them have been, right? Not every modifier is bad, but it's worth noting that, like, man, Reflect has really been like this for almost a decade. And quite frankly, quite a lot of modifiers have been in a state that I felt like should be either readjusted or straight up removed. And it's worth talking about just kind of like as a lesson to the wise as far as things that we can be more active about giving feedback for in PoE 2 so that we avoid the way that we felt about these things in PoE 1. Because as I go through this, you're going to hear me talk about some modifiers that definitely will make you go, oh my God, that's still in the game, right? Ugh. You know what I mean? So before I get into it, look, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. You know the deal. If you're out with the videos, notifications on. Let's get into it. I have a question for you, right? Keep this one in mind as we go through this next couple things. Is it better to have broad strokes, small broad strokes, or large smashing strikes? Think on it. I'll explain it a little bit later. I'm now going to name you a couple modifiers based off of that question. I want you to think about your answer to that question in relation to these modifiers. Number one, monsters cannot be leeched from. Number two, players cannot regenerate life, mana, or energy shield. 3, 70% chance to avoid elemental ailments. 3A, in case that one does not evoke emotion within you. Monsters have a 50% chance to avoid poison, impale, and bleeding. 4, monsters steal power, frenzy, and endurance charges on hit. 5, monsters reflect 18% of elemental or physical, again, depending on which one elicits emotion within you, damage. And 6, players have 60% less recovery rate of life and energy shield. Now, what in the world do all of those modifiers have in common? Why would I name that specific list of them? What emotion am I going for? And you probably already felt it. A little bit of rage, right? One or more of those modifiers, you went, ugh. You remember the fact that you instantly roll over that modifier when you see it on your maps because you're like, this modifier makes my build unplayable for one reason or another. Or in one case in particular, it might just be, this is uncomfortable to deal with, right? And I don't want to deal with that. In other words, these are what I categorize as large smashing strikes. Now, allow me to explain this concept a little bit more, right? Broad strokes, these small broad strokes versus these large smashing strikes. The idea is that a small broad stroke is a modifier that affects pretty much every build, if not literally every build. It just, in a way that you kind of just shrug off, right? Think monster damage, increased life, etc., right? Like, everybody has to deal with the downside of it, but it's not a consideration in how you feel about modifiers in the game, right? And the other side of this is the large smashing strikes, modifiers that come down brutally in the spaces that they do, right? Like the modifiers I named earlier are some really aggressive instances of it, but even just something like suppression or reduced block and armor, or you know, monsters are more accurate, are other examples of smashing strikes of just different sizes, right? And so the overarching question becomes, is it better that a modifier is in fact that punishing such that, you know, when you can't deal with it, it feels awful and you have to roll over it, but when you can deal with it, it feels fantastic? Or is it better for modifiers to just be somewhat there across the board? And it's interesting because this question gets different answers depending on A, your background, but B, and a little bit more importantly, depending on the game that you talk about this in, right? Just as a quick piece of context aside from this, right? Is if you're playing something like WoW, you would actually rather the latter. You would rather the modifiers be low effect. That was like a whole thing that they like really pushed about, was like, we don't like playing the affixes, right? And why is that? It's because in WoW, you're playing the game, right? And it's not to say that in PoE we don't play the game, but in PoE, a large part of the game is your build. It is the making of a build that solves problems that you run into, which means you need it to be the former. You need the game to have problems for you to solve. Even when sometimes you run up into problems that you can't reasonably solve on the character and you go, fuck this shit, man. I hate it here. You have to have problems that you have to be able to solve, because it feels really good when you actually can solve most or all of these problems, right? That's like the big thing with people looking for like early T17 farmers, like builds that can actively ignore most of the problems of T17 modifiers, at least before the changes this season, where you can then be like, oh yeah, I'm in there, the modifiers barely matter, I'm playing the game, my build is doing the thing it's supposed to do, right? That feels fantastic. Or like people who build builds that are able to run all map modifiers, like Balor. He did a build this league on, I believe it was a Necro, that was able to run like maps with the cartography scarab of Risk. That is an insanely dangerous scarab to be putting in your maps if your build's not built for it, right? But being able to solve that problem feels really good. You need that problem solving in order for it to actually feel good. So then why do we hate these modifiers so much, right? If we need problems to solve in order to feel good about the build, why do these modifiers suck so much? Well, here's the thing, right? It's not because they're hard, right? It's not that the modifier is painful, because you'll notice out of the modifiers I named, actually, I like to think I omitted one of the most aggressively oppressive modifiers in the game, quite frankly, and that's just turbo. Most of these modifiers on this list are not nearly as terrifying as just a map with like turbo and some other damage mods. Or, you know, when you roll crit on a map and then you randomly just go, or you hear the like the I'm not gonna make the witch death scream. You can imagine it in your head, right? But like you just fall over and die to getting crit. Or suddenly you rolled turbo on the map and the boss has turbo and increased health. There's nothing you can do here. The boss is farming you like crazy. It's actually the shipyard boss. So they're teleporting onto you with these tendies that go turbo fast and blow you up, right? Like whatever it may be, you're not complaining about these modifiers that I named them earlier because they're hard. Because otherwise, turbo would be like number 3 on your list of modifiers that need to be gone. Like, get this shit out the game. This shit is awful. What it is that these problems are awful to solve, right? The solution to something like turbo is, we'll get a generically tankier character. Maybe you need a source of chill or like temp chains or something just to help mitigate the speed difference, right? Or maybe your character just straight up is not tanky enough for the content you thought you were going to be trying to do, whatever it may be, right? That's a generic problem, that the generic solution to it, right? Even crit kind of falls under that bucket, even though there is this stat, you know, reduced extra damage taken from critical strikes. It's a rare stat for a reason, and you can kind of just outstat it for the most part. Just get more other sources of survivability, you know, maybe some evasion to force crits, like secondary crit rolls, etc. Right? There are ways around it. But the ways around the modifiers I named earlier, and other modifiers that share this category, I didn't even name T17 modifiers for a reason in this video, because I didn't want to draw the attention away from modifiers that I think that the general populace interacts with. Like, yeah, T17 modifiers are bad, but those are in their own bucket, right? Like, these are modifiers you see all the time. And the problem is that they are not easily solvable, right? For example, cannot leech. um I mean, what are you using for recovery realistically in this game if you aren't leeching? It's pretty hard to get your regen up to a point that actually even almost mirrors what leech can do for your character. Especially for life. Mana, you can technically get it there with like a clarity. But mana, life, you were just kind of screwed there. Yes, luckily there's recharge, but you're just kind of stuck sitting there, usually just flasking if you're like worried about your life or your mana, right? No regen is the other side of the exact same problem. And it's like a turbo fuck you to casters, quite frankly, right? Or really just non-attack builds, especially minion builds. Minion builds hate no regen, which honestly, if you're a minion hater, based, right? But like the thing is that this is a problem for a lot of builds because it just kind of means, hey, look, put on a mana flask because your mana is cooked unless you're an attack build. If you're an attack build, for some reason, you still have sources of attack of like mana leech on hit that you then can also turn into instant leech. And honestly, fuck attack builds for that. I don't get why only attack builds have access to that, but hey, look, is what it is, right? But mana build, otherwise, you just get stuck pressing the flask or turning on EB, but like you get what I mean, right? Ailment modifiers. These are horrific. They are probably my like on this list. They're second to me in terms of what has to be removed from the game. I'm glad that Reflect is going away, but these need to go just as expeditiously. And it's just because, specifically the fact that it interacts with damaging ailments. I don't really care that it turns off my ability to freeze things. Like I like my freeze as a defensive layer, or I would like to be able to actually say, impale things for things that count for crit multi and whatnot or whatever. But the real thing is that Ignite, Poison, Impale, Bleeding are all actual damaging status effects. And in the case of not Impale, those are the primary way that their skills deal damage, right? Like when you're playing an Ignite character, your hit is big, air quotes. Even when you play like Divine Ire Ignite back in the day, the hit was not large enough to actually matter relative to the size of that fucking Ignite, right? And if you're playing Poison, your hits are non-existent. If you're playing Bleed, your hits are definitely non-existent because you're playing for one big hit, right? And so you go your big hit and then you don't bleed, and it's awful. And the problem with this is not just does it interact with damage modifiers, but there is no way to actually interact with it, specifically because it rolls against your like hit chance in a very unfavorable way. I get if you think akin to how block works currently, or if you're familiar with how dodge worked previously when it was more present in the game. You roll to apply ailments first, and then the enemy rolls to dodge your ailment. And so it's the same reason that it works for us when we get cannot have ailments applied to us or like ailment avoidance chances, because it's not a one-to-one roll off. It's not, hey, look, I'm gonna roll, you're gonna roll, we're gonna see who rolls higher. It's I'm gonna roll, holy shit, I hit, and then the other guy rolls and he's like, yeah, fuck out of here with that shit, right? Like that's what it's like, that ailment modifier, and that's like the big problem with it. So I think it absolutely has to go. The charge stealing modifier I actually put in here mostly just to see how many people play charge builds and got angry at that one. It's not actually as big of a problem outside of like specifically the charge builds, but I put it in the list because it is in that similar category state as the ailment modifiers, where your build either straight up does not give a fuck about this modifier, or it completely annihilates you, right? Even builds like if you play like my Hex Blast Miner, for example, even builds like that really do not like the charge stealing mod because of how dependent on the stats the charges give us we end up becoming. If you played like Junks, Peacock, Trickster with the replica badge of the Brotherhood, same exact thing, right? Like you're reliant on the charges in a way that it's like not actually playable if the enemies are constantly taking them from less recovery rate. I think it's just a classic understanding of that one just feels awful and honestly feels numerically overtuned. And I think it also just gets really bad when the increased modifier effect comes into play. And you might be thinking, well, just don't stack increased modifier effect. It's worth noting, you don't have to stack it to make this modifier feel borderline unplayable. With the amount of modifier effect that you, quote, stumble your way into, just pathing over good nodes on the tree, trying to like get stuff at the top, you easily end up getting this modifier up to about 75 to 80% reduced reduced life energy shield recovery rate, which means that you're basically just straight up not recovering that shit. Just gonna keep it a buck. Like if you think about the 20% per second that you get from leech and you cut that by 80%, you now get 4%. You're not recovering shit. Just keep it in a buck, right? Like you're fucked. It is what it is. So this modifier ended up being just like a non-starter, unless again you're an attack build with instant leech and on hit leech or life gain on hit. Again, for whatever reason, attack builds just get like an easy pass on this shit ass modifier. But it still sucks even for them. That's the crazy part. And now we get to reflect, because it's a little interesting to talk about reflect in this way because it is going away, right? In PoE 2, anyways, right? And a part of why this one sucks in particular, right? The reason that this one in particular, we all know why this mod in particular, Reflect, is a spawn for an entire video, is a spawn of so much ire in the community. In fact, in my time being a PoE player, I can only really think of like 3 things that we might have unified behind more as a source of hatred than just Reflect on our maps. And the reason why is because it straight up kills you. Everything else you can technically outplay, right? Technically speaking, nothing stops you from just firing Flame Blast into that 70% avoidance map until it ignites. Nothing stops you from just figuring out how to play it from off screen so your charges don't get stolen. Nothing stops you from figuring out how to, like, you know, wait it out a little bit when you need a little bit more time for your recovery to kick in, right? But when you put Reflect on the map, it basically says, have an answer to Reflect or die. There's no in between there. There's no room for player input. There's no room for growth. It is just death. And that's always going to be its biggest problem. I'm so glad it's going away. Rest in fucking piss, right? That's why I bring it up. Because we're going into PoE 2, and it's cool that this got announced to be removed there. I need this shit removed in PoE 1 as well. And I need things like this to never happen again, right? Diablo learned this lesson with the elemental thorns modifiers from back in D3, right? They learned this exact same lesson back in the day. PoE used to have a similar issue with other sources of thorns as well in PoE. There used to be a reflect modifier on monsters. For some reason, Edziri herself still just has like a random 1% reflect that can also happen on the one that spawns in the temple, right? Like, this lesson has been learned before in PoE, that instantly killing your players is bad, because you might think, oh, it's only like 1%, 2% leech. Bitch, we do hundreds of thousands of damage per hit in a lot of cases, right? Fuck you mean only 1%. I do hundreds of thousands per hit to each target I hit, and I hit a couple things, and so I just went kablooey, and that's not fun. And so I hope that not only will this trickle down into PoE 1, but I'm hoping that the removal of Reflect going into PoE 2 is not just them going, oh man, the community really hated specifically Reflect in PoE 2, and so we shouldn't do that again. I'm hoping it's a general understanding that killing your players for playing the game feels bad, right? I feel like that's not a controversial thought at all. I feel like, don't kill us for playing the game. I feel like I'm spitting there. Maybe I'm wrong. Let me know, right? But I feel like I'm spitting when I say that. And that's the whole thing, which it's worth noting. This reflect modifier is not the only thing particularly at fault for doing something like this. But that video is going to have to wait for another time, because this one has run for quite some time. I had a lot of thoughts to get out here, because modifiers have been a problem in the game, at least especially Reflect has been a problem in the game literally since before I started playing. And I started playing back in 2018. It's almost 2025. It's been a long time coming that Reflect gets sent away. You know, I'm glad to see that yet another modifier that people absolutely despise is being taken care of. And I can't wait to see, you know, what other things get taken care of down the line, right? All that said, if you rock with the video, support it. You know the deal. If you want to connect with me elsewhere, or you just want to hear me see what I'm talking about elsewhere, there's a Twitch and a Discord in the description. Let me know you guys' thoughts on these modifier changes, and take a guess if you can think about what other things I'm thinking about that might be, you know, just as egregious or potentially more egregious than Reflect on maps is, right? And all that said, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.